So good morning, everybody. I'm Jamie Camacho. I'm the Director of Special Education Planning and Policy. Welcome to our webinar this morning. As you can see, you have quite a few panelists. So we have everybody's names and offices on this slide. So just so you have an idea who's on the webinar today. We'll move into the next slide, please. So today, what we're hoping that you'll be able to leave the webinar today knowing specifically how your determinations are made and specifically about the data. We know we've had a lot of questions about that. Know where to find data and who to contact at DESE if you have questions about your data. We're hoping that you're going to understand how to adjust maintenance of effort calculations if needed. Understand the impact of special education determinations on your various leadership roles. So for example, what does the special education determinations have to do? What importance does it have for special ed directors? What importance does it have for a business manager that's looking at budgeting, principals, teachers, superintendents? So we're hoping that we're going to be able to clarify some of that for you as well. And then finally, we're giving you some examples of some different evidence-based frameworks for improvement planning so that you'll have some resources, some tools, and some things that you hopefully can walk away with something that might be helpful for you where you are in your district with the planning that you're working on now. We'll move on to the next slide. So this is the plan for this morning. We're going to start by talking about the big picture, about the special education determinations. What are they? How are the determinations calculated? Specifically, Erica's going to talk about the data. We know we've had a lot of questions about that, so we're going to clarify some of that and answer some of the questions that we've been receiving. Caitlin's going to be talking about maintenance of effort. You told us that this is an area that you wanted to hear more about, so we're hoping we can answer some of those questions today as well. Bonnie Rastogi-Kelly and her team are going to talk about, Amy Pollan are going to talk about tiered focus monitoring. Dean is going to talk about PRS. As you know, that's also one of the data points that we used in the determinations. And then finally, we're going to finish up by talking about how you can use this information, what are some of the strategies, the tools that you can use when you're looking at the improvement planning in your district, specifically for students with disabilities. And I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Holly. If you have questions that come up during the webinar, feel free to send them to Bonnie and I through the Q&A. If you could add your district name and an email address in case we don't get to your questions, we want to make sure that we're able to get back to you. We'd appreciate that. And we'll do the best that we can to answer questions. And if not today, we'll be sure to get back to you. So Holly, I think it's on to you.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. I'm Holly Neal from the Special Education Planning and Policy Office. And we're going to start with the Special Education Accountability and Assistance Big Picture. Before I go on, I just want to assure you that there's nothing in this presentation that is new. You might hear about some resources that are new to you, but the intent of this webinar is to clarify the process of making determinations and provide easy to use resources in order to reduce the burden on you. So let's start with some high level context. Thank you. When you hear general supervision, you may think educator evaluation. That's not what we're talking about here. IDEA defines systems for special education, and those systems are called general supervision. And it's the grounding framework for DESE's special education work. General supervision has 8 components that include fiscal management, integrated monitoring activities, improvement correction, incentives and sanctions, policies, procedures, and effective implementation, targeted technical assistance and professional development, effective dispute resolution, data on processes and results, and of course, the state performance plan and annual performance report. Determinations are part of this general supervision puzzle and part of its functions. And of course, all of these puzzle pieces interact and influence each other as part of the special education accountability and assistance. Next slide. IDEA defines the primary focus of general supervision as well. It is to improve students with disabilities, educational results, and functional outcomes, which aligns to the department's mission, which is, as you know, to prepare students to succeed in post-secondary education, compete in the global economy, and understand civic rights and responsibilities in order to close all proficiency gaps. Next slide. Under IDEA, DESE must make annual determinations about districts' specific needs for technical assistance or intervention in special education. Massachusetts does so based on the same 4 categories that OSEP uses to make state determinations. For LEAs outside of meets requirements, IDEA requires 2 things. 1, LEAs to have a corrective action plan or an improvement plan. And 2, DESE needs to provide assistance, monitor, and publicly report, and also manage the conditions on IDEA funding, which is maintenance of effort, which we'll be going over later in this presentation. In Massachusetts, special education determinations and assistance are also aligned to the overall accountability system for all students. And this year we have strong assistance collaboration within DESE. In order to support you, the Special Education Planning and Policy Office, the Office of Public School Monitoring, the statewide system of support, the Office of School Turnaround, and the Office of Charter Schools and School Redesign are all collaborating. And before I go on, I want to step back for just a second. There's a common reason why we do this, we being all of us. It's for kids. We want to better support students. And this is a way to break down the silos between general education and special education so that DESE can provide aligned and collaborative improvement support to you. Next slide. And I believe I'm handing it over to Erica.
Thanks, Holly. Good morning, everyone. Erica Gonzalez from the Office of District and School Accountability Systems. And so I am going to be talking a little bit about how these determinations are made. I do want to just take a quick step back and issue like a little bit of clarification. In the past, special education determinations were directly aligned with the results that came out of our district and school accountability system. We have taken a break from that in more recent years, but as Holly noted, we are aligning some of our efforts and some of the measures that are included in the district special education determinations, which is why I'm supporting some of the work around these determinations. So if you want to move on to the next slide, please. I'm sure you all at this point have seen your determinations as well as the rubric that we use to arrive at those determinations, but I just wanted to generally talk about what's in that rubric and then talk a little bit about the process that we used. So you'll note that it's a pretty large table with 7 indicators in it, 7 measures in it. And they're broken down, as you can see here, in a number of different categories. Some are sort of the accountability for all students, right? And that includes some of our high school completion data, specifically for students with disabilities in your district, the dropout rate and the 5-year. But also included in this calculation are a number of special education compliance and performance measures, information that comes out of public school monitoring and PRS, as well as the state performance plan and annual performance report measures like compliance and performance indicators that you can see here. And then finally, we have this other indicator, which is significant disproportionality data, as you are all familiar with. And those are individual measures that are combined together to issue your overall special education determination. Next slide, please. So what you can see here is essentially the top half of that table that I'm referring to here with the 7 columns, one for each indicator. And the criteria for each of those indicators that would earn you 4 or 3 points within this calculation. And I'm not going to walk through each of these because it's a lot to take in. But essentially what we do as a process very systematically is for each indicator, take a look at your data for that indicator. So specifically in this, my example might be for annual dropout rate, and compare your special education or your students with disabilities dropout rate to the 4-point criteria. If you do not meet it, compare it to the 3-point criteria, and work our way down the table until we find that point criteria that your data align with. And that's how we assign the points. And we do that for each of the measures across this entire table. Next slide, please. This is the bottom half of that table. Rows are here for 2 points and for 1 point. And like I said, we just work our way down 4, 3, 2, 1 in terms of looking at your data compared to the criteria for each point assignment. What we do then, thank you, is a simple percentage calculation. So we add up the points awarded for each of your indicators. Some of the indicators in that table you'll note are weighted a little more than others. The points would be multiplied by 2. That is only for certain indicators. For example, the 5-year cohort graduation rate and the SPP APR performance indicators number 5 and 6. Those are weighted a little bit more heavily based on priority for the department and for some of the efforts that we're putting forth and working with our districts. So again, adding up all of the points earned across all of the categories with reportable data. And this is an important thing to keep in mind. Your district may not have reportable data for each and every measure that's listed in that column. For example, if your district only serves grades K through 8, your district does not have an annual dropout rate or a 5-year cohort graduation rate. That does not harm you, so to speak, in the calculation. It's just that those measures and the total number of measures that we're looking at might be slightly different for your district than for, say, a district that serves all of grades K through 12. So we add up all of the points earned across all of the categories for which you have data and divide that by the number of possible points that you could have earned. So everything is out of a possible 4, or in the case where we're doing a multiplier by 2, possible 8 points. That division will bring you to a percentage, and that is your special education determination percentage. The Special Education Planning and Policy Office worked with us to determine how we would break those percentages down into ranges that we would then assign the overall determination to that range. So you can see in this table below, if your overall percentage is 75 or higher, you would arrive in that meets requirements category. And then we broke it down into different ranges of percentages for needs assistance and the needs intervention categories. Needs substantial intervention, you can see here there is no percentage range listed. This has to do, the assignment of this category would not take into consideration the percentage, but would instead look at substantial failure in compliance with certain IDEA requirements. So that's the general calculation process. We apply this to every data that has, every district, excuse me, that has data for, I believe, at least 4 indicators. And then that is translated into your district's overall special education determination. Next slide, please. So I know that when these were issued, this raised a lot of questions about what your data was that went into these calculations. And so hopefully when you are looking at the rubric, you'll see that each of the columns includes a year, and that is the year of the data that we're applying to this particular calculation, the 2021 special education determinations. On this slide is just for each of the measures that's included in the calculation, places that you can go or resources that you can refer to see your sort of source data, your underlying data. Some of these, as Holly mentioned, they're not new. They've been around for quite some time, but perhaps you've never really spent a great deal of time looking at your dropout rate data. So there's a link to a lot of our different public reports that include some of these different measures and specific district level data for individual measures. And then in other instances, there's just offices that you can reach out to if you do have specific questions about, for example, your problem resolution system complaints and how they were identified, which we then used within the calculation. Next slide, please. And then I just want to highlight this here because as you'll note, just sort of based on the panel, a number of us work in a variety of different offices at the department. So if you have questions about specific pieces of data that go into these calculations, you may need to reach out to different offices. So contact information is listed here. Also, if you just have a general question about how the overall determinations were made, if it wasn't covered completely, or you just have some follow-up questions, you can certainly reach out to the Special Education Planning and Policy Office with those larger questions, and they can help connect you to those of us on the panel that might be able to provide more information. So I'm just going to take a quick second here. I see a couple questions came through that apply specifically to my session. I'm happy to address those now and then be available if any others come up. One question is, how are the percentages within the rubric determined? And I believe if that's, if you're referring to some of the percentages that we assigned to, for example, annual dropout rate or cohort graduation rate data, those were based sometimes on a state threshold for all students or a state threshold for students with disabilities. In other instances, it's based on a specific threshold of like a percentile for the group. And then others are more closely connected to figures that we use within the accountability system. So there's some variance depending on the measure that you're looking at. If you do have some specific questions about that, we can certainly spend some time talking about it offline. The second question that I have here is the numerator and the denominator in that percentage calculation change for each district based on the available data, and that is correct. So for example, if your district does not have PSM compliance data for a specific year, that information is not going to be included in that year's calculation. And again, that's not replacing your possible points with a 0. It just means that that measure is not included in the denominator as well. And those were the only 2 questions that came through for me.
Thank you, Erica, for answering the questions.
Sure.
Okay, Caitlin, MOE.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Hogan. I'm with the Audit and Compliance Office, and I oversee MOE. We're including this in the presentation today because we do know that some people still struggle with it, and a lot of questions around the allowable exceptions and adjustments and your determinations do affect the ability to use MOE adjustments. Next slide. So MOE is required for all LEAs. Anybody that receives IDEA funds must budget and spend at least what they spent on state and local funds for special education. And there are 4 ways that you can meet MOE. The law gives you 4 options, which are you use your state and local funds, local only funds, and then per capita state and local or per capita local. Next slide. So in Mass, because of Chapter 70 funding, we can only allow to have your state and local expenditures or your per capita state and local. So your Chapter 70 funding, it gets commingled with your general fund, so there's no way of separating it out to distinguish state and local. So the only true state funds that we can determine are your circuit breaker, and that is included in your MOE calculation. So there's two parts to MOE. One is the eligibility, which you have to budget for special education, and that all that information is collected on the IDEA consolidated grant application. And then the compliance standard, which is your actual spending on special education, which we review and collect on the end of year report. So for the eligibility piece, you must budget for the education of students with disabilities. And we collect all of that on the application, like I said before. We review, the federal grants office will review it. If there anybody that isn't budgeting or isn't meeting MOE based on your budget, they'll contact us and then we'll reach out to you to see, if you have any allowable exceptions or adjustments. Next slide. And the compliance standard, you have to maintain or increase the amount of state and local funds spent on students from year to year. And we compare it to the last time that you actually met MOE. So it might not be your previous year, it might be, 2 years, 3 years ago. So we actually have data going back to fiscal year 13 to keep track and to work with you to make sure that you're meeting MOE using one of the two methods. Next slide. So there are exceptions to MOE if you're not meeting. There is the voluntary departure of staff. So it's either if they resign, retire, take a leave of absence, or if they were terminated, you can apply their salary and benefits to the decrease in your MOA. There's also a decrease in enrollment. So when we review the compliance side of MOA, we actually look at your SIMS data, and we will take into account the decrease. So if we contact you that you're not meeting MOE, we've already looked at your decrease to see if it applies. And if it does, and you meet using that exception, then we won't even contact you. The next one is a termination of costly program. So if a student no longer needs a certain service, then the cost of that service can go towards the reduction. And then the termination of a costly expenditure. There is the fifth exception is the assumption of costs by DESE. This rarely has ever happened, so it's not usually something that we even have to deal with. So the exceptions are allowed for all districts, regardless of the determination level. Next slide. So the adjustments, you can reduce your MOE by 50% of your increase of your IDEA grant. So if your allocation last year to this year was $100 more, you can decrease your MOE by 50. And then there's also the voluntary use of CEIS, which goes into the adjustments, and you can take 15% voluntarily of your IDEA funds to use for CEIS. If you choose to do this and the 50% adjustment, then you have to, the total for the two can't equal more than the lesser of the two. So it can be a little confusing, but we have the MOE QRG, which goes into more detail and has a chart and more explanations. The one thing with the adjustments is that it can only be used if you have a determination of the meets requirements. So anything below that, you're not allowed to use the adjustment. So this is why, the determinations do affect your MOA. So the consequences of not meeting the eligibility standard, we review it on the application. If you're not meeting the eligibility piece, which means you're not budgeting what you've spent in the previous year or the previous time that you met MOE, you're not allowed to get the IDEA grant. This hardly has ever happened. So we will work with you if you're not meeting, if you're not budgeting enough. We'll work with you to find out what you have, if you have any allowable exceptions that you think are going to be coming up. So if you know that a teacher isn't going to be there next year, that's one of the allowable exceptions. Next slide. The compliance, so at the beginning of every year, we'll pull the end of year report data and the SIMS data, and we'll look at your actual spending. So if you're not meeting MOE, again, we'll contact you to find out, what happened and which exception will apply. If you're still not meeting MOE with the allowable exceptions, you will have to pay back the difference that you're not meeting MOE or your 240 grant, whichever is the lesser of the two. And then here are some resources. So the quick reference guide goes into the adjustments a little bit more. We have the calculator, which if you're not meeting MOE, I will send you the calculator kind of completed with historic data. There's also, if you want the information, you can contact me and I can kind of put it together for you just so you have it. And then it's just the federal regulations. Let me see. So there's no questions.
Thank you, Caitlin. Right now, there are no questions for you, so thank you so much. And on to Amy.
Thank you, Jamie. My name is Amy Pollan. I'm the Assistant Director of Public School Monitoring. I'm going to talk a little bit about our tiered focus monitoring. And on the next slide, we're just going to take a closer look at that chart that Erica provided at the beginning that sort of explains where these percentages and determinations come from. So in terms of tiered focus monitoring, which I know that you are all very familiar with, we assigned the points based on 2020 and 21 TFM special education findings. So if you did have a review last school year, either a group A or a group B review, we only looked at the special education findings. And predominantly, most of the people on this call fell into either a point value of 3 or a point value of 4. And again, like Erica said, if you did not have a review last year, this did not count against you. It was just not included in the final calculation. So in terms of resources, which are on our next slide, as I'm sure you're very familiar with, they're really specific to the particular finding, the particular special education finding. So we did include some more general resources here, including our webpage and our toolkit, but quite honestly, it's really your connection with the TFM chairperson that provides any sort of resources and guidance and critical thinking around how to bring certain areas of non-compliance into compliance. And so some of you are already working very, very closely with your chair people. It could be around the SPED determinations or particular findings that have already been made. And this is done through continuous improvement monitoring plans and corrective action plans with progress updates and progress reports. So most of you are already really involved in this process, or you're preparing for a review next year. And certainly some of the findings that have been made connect really closely with some of the issues that arose in the SPED determinations, including LRE rate or graduation rates. But certainly if you find that there are any sort of connections that you are seeing in your TFM review and you want to connect with your chairperson, absolutely, if that hasn't been done already, please feel free to do that. And certainly you can reach out to me with any questions as well. So don't want to spend too much time talking about the TFM review, but just really of how it relates to the SPED determinations. So I believe this is, we're going to hear from Dean next and about PRS. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.
Good morning. I'm going to give you an overview of the PRS complaint procedures and an overview of what PRS is for those of you who might be new to your particular roles. Next slide, please. So as you can see from this slide, we deal with special education and general education requirements. We're one of the 2 states that address compliance in both general ed, the other being Oregon. When we do general ed complaints, we apply the same procedures established for the ones that we do for special education for the general ed complaints, meaning the superintendent office will be notified. A copy of that intake form will be sent to the superintendent's office. We will send a request for local report, and we will ask the district for a particular response time for that local report. And we generally have to complete these within 60 days. It is not necessary also when you see any party wishing to file a complaint may do so. it is not necessary for the complainant to be a parent of the student, and we can take a complaint from any individual in any organization, and we also will handle allegations of systemic noncompliance. Related to the BSEA doesn't review what PRS does, but they will potentially look in the same areas. If you end up in a BSEA proceeding and there's an open complaint with PRS, we'll review it to see if any of the matters in the PRS intake are going to the BSEA. If so, what we will do is set that aside. If it's mediation, we wait for the completion of mediation to see if we can pick up those issues after the mediation is complete. If it's a BSEA hearing and it's dealing with those same issues, that's the extent of the work with PRS. One of the questions we sometimes get, well, how is PRS different from the BSEA? And the best way I can explain it is that we're kind of the quick and dirty process for resolution. Next slide, please. So you can see from our mission statement, what is PRS? Our duties are not limited to complaints. We deal with restraint reports. Anytime there is a restraint that's being sent to the state, we will look at those reports. We may reach out to you if we have any questions about what we see in those restraint reports. We also do such things as special education approval for waivers, whether it's age span, PACs, or alternative compliance waivers. We are also responsible for the development of public day programs, whether those are collaborative or run by districts. We also manage the BSEA follow-up. If there's a hearing officer will write their determinations, they may identify system failures, some type of procedural errors. We will do the follow-up, and we will do the follow-up for BSA to ensure the implementation of any corrective actions that they've ordered. Our unit also is responsible for handling homeless issues and foster care. Disputes for school attendance generally is what is the main areas for the homelessness and foster care. And we provide general technical assistance for general education problems as well in special education. We have authority concerning making a determination of whether an IEP is reasonably calculated to provide FAPE. And yes, we also have the authority to order compensatory services, as some of you may know. Our office does not handle the complaints per se for those complaints filed against special education private schools, whether day or residential. Because there is some LEA responsibility for those, it might be a joint effort with our colleagues in the Office of Approved Special Education Schools, OACs. So they'll handle the component for the private school, and we'll handle anything that might be an allegation concerning the LEA. Next slide, please. Here you'll see, this is from the federal regulation. These are minimum components for PRS to actually open an investigation. If it's related to special education, an organization or individual must meet these requirements in order for PRS to proceed. And please note that we have a 1-year limitation. How we measure that 1 year is from the date of receipt of that intake going back to that 1 year. So if it was received today, 4/28/22, we would go back up to 4/28/21. Next slide, please. So to give you an idea, there's a number of different categories, and these are not exhaustive. These are the major areas that we've seen over numerous years of the types of complaints that we might have in PRS. The ones, of course, that you're most concerned about is special ed implementation procedures. You'll notice that we separated home and hospital out from those two, because home and hospital also can be something that's benefited general ed students. So it's distinct, even though it's in the special ed regulations, it is a distinct category. There are others. As I said, this list is not exhaustive, and we're surprised sometimes to find out some of the areas we're also responsible for under general ed. Having said that, as you can see, if you had any questions about any of these areas, you should certainly contact PRS. Next slide, please. And so here's our contact information, and I would encourage you, we're not just here taking complaints, we provide a lot of technical assistance pretty much about all those areas that you saw on the previous slide. We can provide some technical assistance and guidance to you. We are available by email, by telephone, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Dean. We have answered almost all the questions at this point. I think we'll keep moving. We have a couple more questions in the Q&A that we'll get to shortly.
So now we're going to talk about closing gaps. And again, none of this will be new to you, just hopefully organized in a way that's easy for you to access and use. I'm going to start with, what does the research show? In schools where the general education population is successful, all students are more likely to do well. The achievement of pre-K through 12 students with disabilities and their peers without disabilities is tightly linked. And all students can benefit from evidence-based core instructional practices. I'm sure this is not news to any of you. Next slide. So let's take 10 seconds to jot down 3 strengths of your LEA in general education and special education. This is an important part of this conversation. We need to ground ourselves in our strengths, both in general education and special education, because then we can continuously reflect on how we can use those to move forward with improvement for students with disabilities. The 3 strengths that you listed and other strengths can and should be a resource to help you in your work to close gaps. Next slide. When we say gaps in this context, what does it mean? So gaps may indicate that the educational program that your LEA offers is not meeting the needs of all groups of children. And when this continues, the gaps often result in poor outcomes for children in the affected groups. So gaps can exist between different racial ethnic groups or relate to factors such as disability categories, English learner status, low income, migrant status, or other factors. Addressing gaps requires a close look at issues of equity, inclusion, and opportunity. It's important to conduct an in-depth analysis across all groups of children throughout a school or district, especially those struggling academically or behaviorally. And this is the process that I will be focusing on today, along with immediate use tools that can streamline and lighten your work. Next slide. Outcome gaps are not about an individual child or a group of children's failure to perform. The work focuses on system-level thinking and structures by examining the differences in opportunities students have experienced, and also student-specific groups and outcome areas that have gaps. So for example, the graduation rate of students who are English learners with disabilities compared to the graduation rate of all other children. The out of school suspension rate of students with disabilities who are Black compared to the suspension rate of all other children. Or placement rates of students with disabilities in your LEA compared to similar LEAs or the state rate, and other kinds of gaps. Next slide. There are 3 goals for engaging in this work in closing gaps, is to discover root causes, identify underlying issues, and apply what you've learned to prevent future issues. So outcome gaps can be similar in multiple LEAs, but each LEA's root cause and contributing factors may look very different from one another. For this reason, there's no one evidence-based practice that will magically improve a success gap for all LEAs. Your district's lessons learned as you engage in the process itself can drive your LEA's improvement work, and it should drive the selection of any evidence-based or high leverage practice that you implement as a result. Next slide. We recommend using one of these two planning frameworks. Identification and use of a planning framework is actually required. So the two that we recommend using, choosing one or the other or blending them. The first is Planning for Success, which is the Massachusetts recommended planning process for education. The reason we included the Success Gaps Toolkit too is because it's generally aligned with the Planning for Success framework, but it's designed for IDEA related improvement and has some immediate use like plug and play tools that can be used with any research-based planning framework. These two frameworks in particular are flexible and can be modified to fit your needs. And what's really important is we're looking for you to leverage your current improvement work and strengths and add aspects of special education outcomes to that work. We don't want you to recreate the wheel. We're looking for you to strengthen that wheel. So for example, how can this work align and link to your current SOA work? And if you are already engaged in a sustainable improvement plan, how can outcomes for students with disabilities be incorporated into that? Next slide. The essential elements of a planning framework are database decision-making, cultural responsiveness, core instructional program, ongoing assessment, universal screening and progress monitoring, evidence-based instructional and positive behavioral interventions and supports, district and school leadership that facilitates improvement, and parent-family engagement throughout the educational process and system. So no matter what planning framework you choose, all 7 of these elements should be evident somewhere in the framework. And also, as a helpful hint, be sure to select a planning framework that includes tools and resources that help support you to do the district's planning. Next slide. Okay, we have a poll. So we would like to know, do you already have a planning framework that you use? And if so, which one? Listed there are Planning for Success, the Success Gaps Toolkit, Active Implementation, DataWise, using formative assessment, assessment for results, and other. Also, there's a selection for none, which you have to scroll down to see. So we've got about 32 of the participants have answered. I'm going to wait a few more seconds. Go ahead and enter which framework that you use, or if you don't use one. People are still adding their responses. So we're going to wait for a few more seconds. Thank you very much. Okay, right now it looks like 24% of you use Planning for Success. 8% use the Success Gap Toolkit. 2% active implementation. 16% data-wise. And using formative assessment for results, 14%. Other is 12%. And 25% are just starting in the process. Thank you. Next slide. So for those of you who selected none, take 10 seconds to jot down the name of 2 people who can help you select a planning framework. For everyone else, you want to use the process you know. So for this activity, you might jot down names of 2 people who can help review some of the resources and links in this PowerPoint and recommend helpful additions to your process. Remember, we're looking for you to leverage your current improvement work and strengths and to add aspects of special education to that work. We don't want you to recreate the wheel. So take a few more seconds. Next slide. It's late in the year. We know there's not a lot of time to do improvement work. So today we're going to cover the first 5 bullets in the arrow, which include identifying the gaps, assembling an equity team with a focus on students with disabilities outcomes, preparing, sharing, and analyzing multiple sources of data, identifying and validating root causes of the gap, and prioritize actionable root causes. Next year, we'll provide support around the last 3 bullets, which look at developing an action plan all the way through monitoring progress on that plan. This is not meant to require duplicative work or to slow down work you're already doing currently. If your LEA is already doing your data analysis and root cause analysis, you can move on to the last 3 steps when you're ready. The planning framework links that we've provided also provide tools and resources to support these steps. Next slide. So an essential first step is to actually identify the gap. It's important to be very clear about who, what, and where the gap is that's been identified in the determination rubric. As you review the data for the identified student group or groups, you can ask yourself the tried and true questions like, what do you observe? What does your analysis of other factors make you wonder? Things like, what about attendance for this group of students, or behavior, or course performance and credit accumulation? And what do your questions about this student group make you wonder about the educational experience of all students, including those with and without disabilities across the LEA? You'll notice on the bottom of the slides in orange, there are 2 resources that will help you write your gap statement. On the left is an impact profile, and on the right is a resource from the Success Gaps Toolkit that supports writing a gaps statement. You can use either of those or blend them, or use another process that you already use to identify that gap. Next slide. Here are examples of success gaps. So for instance, the high school graduation rate for students with disabilities who are economically disadvantaged is less than half the rate of the non-economically disadvantaged children and is in the lowest 10% of the state. Or white children are 4 times as likely as students with disabilities of other races and ethnicities to be identified with autism. Another example is English learners with disabilities are 3.5 times as likely as non-English learners with disabilities to be placed in a separate school. And the last example here is students with disabilities who are Black are 50% less likely than their peers to test proficient in English language arts and mathematics at all tested grade levels. So that's the type of clarity that you want to make sure that you have on what the gap is that you're looking to improve. Next slide. Who do you count on for collecting, analyzing, and explaining district and school data? Take 10 seconds to jot down the name of the person who can help you write an initial gap statement. This could be your district data coordinator, or maybe a school psychologist, or maybe someone else. Okay, next slide. Step 2, to successfully address gaps, your district or school will need to assemble an equity team. No one person working alone can address long-standing systemic inequities in an educational system. It's not possible. Also, because equity work touches so many different parts of the school, it often requires working across departments or schools. We encourage you to be strategic and flexible. For example, if it makes more sense to repurpose an existing data team, then of course do that instead of assembling a new team. Also, it's very important to be clear what you're asking of the team and not asking of the group. There are 5 crucial items that will help you avoid mission creep, which are listed here on the slide: mission and goals, roles and responsibilities, effective group processes, ground rules, and decision-making. And on the bottom of this slide, you'll see again 2 sets of resources. Planning for Success provides the 2 resources to help with this process, and the Success Gaps Toolkit provides 1. And they are both linked at the bottom of this slide. Next slide. Quality results are really dependent on ensuring representation of diverse perspectives on your team. It helps in the long run with things like shared understanding of the work, trust, and also buy-in and ownership. So, for example, have you or can you consider cross-representation of stakeholder groups, like representation by a curriculum director or a school principal, family representation, representation of general education professionals and special education professionals, possibly student representation, community partners, and of course, professionals who can provide and interpret data. We recommend including stakeholders who have experience working with the groups of children you've identified in the gap statement, and also those with lived experience. It helps to ensure that all perspectives are represented, considered, and valued. But it's important to keep in mind that not all of this needs to be done at once. It's likely that you'll need to add additional voices as you go through the process, as you learn more about what's causing the gap and what is required to resolve that gap. Next slide. Here are some additional resources for this step. For example, those of you who have used and love the DESE District Data Team Toolkits materials, keep using them. The rest of the resources here are plug and play or immediate use tools. For example, an invitation to participate on the team, roles and responsibilities, group norms, and a template for meeting notes. Next slide. Take 10 seconds to jot down the names of 3 people who can help you design a team. For those of you who already have a team, you may want to, in part, repurpose that team for this work. So you can jot down any shifts or additions to membership, specifically folks who can help you focus on students with disabilities and their outcomes. Next slide. Step 3 consists of preparing the data, meeting with your team to share and annualize the data, and then refining your initial gap statement based on the ahas that your team has during the process. The in-depth results you want requires really digging into the data. To do this, you can consider questions like, what do you observe when you aggregate the data in different ways? What about when you disaggregate it? Is other related data surprising or telling, like data on attendance, behavior, and course performance, and credit accumulation? And you'll notice at the bottom of this slide, the Success Gaps Toolkit has support for this process, and it is linked at the bottom of this slide. Next slide. The additional resources for this step include, again, the DESE's District Data Team Toolkit materials. And there's a template to help refine the initial gap statement. The next 2 bullets are data visualization tools. So if you want support with making charts or graphs or even creating an infographic, they're here. Just a note, on these 2 resources. They were originally designed for the SEA, or the State Education Authority, which is DESE. However, most of the data visualization tabs can be used by LEAs, so it's still worth a look. Also, there is a data meeting toolkit protocols and templates, which may be helpful to you and save time. So for instance, tools like what to do before, during, and after the meeting. Next slide. Step 4 is a self-assessment of the context by the team. You'll notice that Planning for Success has 2 resources, and the Success Gap Toolkit actually includes a rubric, and they're all linked there. The steps for both of these protocols include completing the self-assessment individually and then building consensus as a team. Planning for Success leads you through a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis, and then leads you through a root cause analysis, which basically the process asks you to list what you consider to be the highest priority items or the items of greatest importance or impact in response to each question. The Success Gap Toolkit uses a rubric that covers these 5 essential elements from the list that we talked about before to reach the root cause. So it's a much more structured self-assessment, but they are all evidence-based. So those resources are linked and ready for you to use. Next slide. Some of you may be asking yourself, what is a root cause? The root cause is a fundamental reason that the success gap is occurring. The reason that, like, if it's addressed, it would dramatically improve the issue in your gap statement. It's also important to pay particular attention to actionable root causes. So things that are within your locus of control. Next step. Next slide. Here's an example of a fictitious LEA. Let's call it Goodtown Public School District. Its gap statement is, from a previous slide, the high school graduation rate for students with disabilities who are economically disadvantaged is less than half the rate of the non-economically disadvantaged students and is in the lowest 10% of the state. Goodtown has one school with a large number of students who are not meeting the proficiency targets in math, and so they're looking to make improvement. They could choose to provide additional minutes of math instruction to those students. And while this approach would be helpful in the short term, because Goodtown has not done a full root cause analysis, they may find that each year they have to continue providing this additional instruction for a large group of its students. This issue may continue because for this school, it's treated a symptom of the problem rather than the root cause. When they do a closer inspection of the school's historical data, it reveals that the core instructional approach is not a good fit for students who are English language learners. In this case, when Goodtown intervenes by implementing instructional methods that meet the needs of this group of students as well as other students, it will find that far fewer children need supplemental support moving forward. So had Goodtown done a root cause analysis, it would have been able to improve student outcomes more immediately. And as I said before, next year we'll dig into improvement planning. But for those of you who are already there, let's do a quick preview for this LEA. Goodtown may want to consider how might a stronger collaboration between general education, special education, and L acquisition increase the kind of inclusive opportunities in their LEA? And how could they use that to be able to extend their continuum of services and placements without stretching resources tighter? Another question that they may ask themselves is how might the strong new curriculum be better blended with appropriate supports for all students to succeed? And how could educators from general education, special education, and language acquisition be trained and collaborate together? Another thing that they could be asking themselves is what can they opt into that is available through DESE already, so they don't have to recreate the wheel? Possibly looking at Curate for high quality instructional materials, or the Targeted Partnership Program Catalog that just came out for 2022-2023. They could even look at DESE's PD registry in order to identify easily a high quality PD provider. Next slide. For this step, we included additional resources like the 5 Whys protocol and a root cause analysis with the dimension bullseye of improvement. Those are from the Planning for Success protocols. We also included the Success Gap Toolkits rubric, as well as support for setting root cause priorities. Next slide. For our last activity, take 10 seconds to jot down any thoughts, questions, or epiphanies. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Abby Slayton and Brian Coonley.
Hi, folks. Good afternoon. I'm going to spend a few minutes describing to you the Making Money Matter project, which we refer to as M cubed, because we believe and research evaluations show that there's an exponential value to this program. It's a Massachusetts initiative that's been in place for the last 6 years. And been shown to be quite effective at helping districts to make system-wide improvements to services for students with disabilities. It is designed to help you develop and implement these system-wide approaches to improvements that align with your district's overall goals for improving services to all students. The way the program works is that it reserves 2% of your IDEA funds for such activities, although you could spend more as well. Activities can include things like data collection and review, strategic planning time for your staff to work together to determine what are the best systemic approaches to improving services, and then actual systemic interventions. The resources that you've had access to and have been described to you in this webinar are very helpful in this process. Any district, of course, can use funds to do these kinds of activities, but some districts are designated to participate in this program. Those districts, it's new this year what the eligibility criteria is, and you'll see on the slide that this year it will be districts whose special education determination is needs intervention. Those districts will participate in M cubed and will be eligible for support from the statewide system of support staff to help them develop and implement their programs. I think that if you would like more information, you can see on the slide how to reach me, and the base landing website for the details of the program, what it's trying to accomplish, and the resources that are available for it on our website. Once you go to that landing page, there are links to other pages as well, and you'll see links directly back to some of these resources that have already been described to you. And I'll take any questions that people put in Q&A, and if we can't answer them now, we'll answer them on afterwards individually. Thank you. Brian, your turn.
Thank you, Abby. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Coonley. I work in the Office of Special Education Planning and Policy on some of our equity and special education work. So if we're going to talk about one part of that, say one funding source that you can use to serve your students. But if you do have questions around indicators 4, 9, and 10 and significant disproportionality that go into these special education determinations, I'm also glad to answer those as we get into the Q&A section. So right now we're going to talk about what's called Coordinated Early Intervening Services, or CEIS. This is a unique scenario set forth in IDEA that allows districts to set aside funds to support students in K through 12 who are currently not identified as needing special education or related services. So this is a very unique scenario, only 2 really scenarios where this is allowed, where you can use your 240 funding and that 262 and 240 funding to support students who are currently not eligible, but who need additional academic or behavioral supports to succeed in the general education curriculum. The idea being that you might mitigate some of the issues that you're seeing as you do your root cause analysis, as you go through the whole process that Holly just talked about. It's a way for you to fund moving into some of those next steps. It allows any LEA, any of you here today, to reserve up to 15% of that IDEA Part B funding for these services to address the needs of your students. If you want more information about what the funding can and cannot be used for, or have questions or things you know as you start brainstorming that you think about, first I would recommend taking a look at the resource link there that comes from the IDEA Data Center that will gives an outline of what the funds can be used for. And if you have further questions as you start thinking about this over the next few weeks or months, or as you fill out your consolidated grant application this fall, feel free to send our office, or you can even directly email me, and I can work with you to answer those questions. So this is this unique scenario where you will be able to use these funds to do some of this work. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A and I will answer them.
Ryan, I'm going to follow up with a question that came in a little bit ago. And it's not directly related to that last slide, but I know there's a lot of times there's confusion between all the different accountability systems that we have and the different types of accountability notifications that we send out. So when we're talking about identification for significant disproportionality, and we're talking about the 15% reserve that's required, is there any impact that these special education determinations have on that 15% reserve?
No, there's not any requirements on the 15% set aside that is required for districts that have been identified with significant disproportionality in special education, which for some of you that might be part of your special education determination, and those calculations, it is part of it as one of those, if you look at the rubric, one of those categories. But there is no required set aside of 15% for the special education determinations, as there is for any district that's identified with significant disproportionality. And if you are a district identified with significant disproportionality, you will know so. We've contacted you last fall and provided professional development and technical assistance and support over the last year, and action plans were actually due earlier this week. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about for identification for significant disproportionality, that means you weren't identified for this school year. But if you have any more specific questions around that, feel free to ask.
Thank you, Ryan. Holly, can you talk a little bit about what the requirements are as far as evidence-based improvement planning? Or if there are any requirements for evidence-based improvement planning, and the purpose of us including all the resources about different frameworks and different resources that are evidence-based.
So yes, there is a requirement to use an evidence-based planning framework. However, we want you to use that framework within the context of other improvement planning that's going on in your district. So if you already have an improvement plan, we'd like you to roll this into your current improvement planning. For this year, those districts who need intervention, you already know what you are required to do with your end of year summary. We've met with, I believe, everyone at this point. For those of you who are in needs assistance, we'd like you to start working on the root cause analysis. Next year, we'll be ramping up a little bit more, and we'll be providing you resources on actually doing action planning and implementation, as well as progress monitoring.
Thank you, Holly. And Holly, Amy, Bonnie, as Erica mentioned, there's a lot of different offices that are working with districts on some of the different aspects of the determination. So I just want to make sure that we're clear. So we have, there's no reporting requirements for any districts but those that are needing intervention. Is that correct, Holly?
That is correct.
Okay. And the end of the year report that you're talking about is for the districts that are NI districts that we're working with the Office of Special Education Planning and Policy. So our team.
Oh, yes, yes. Right.
And then Bonnie and Amy are working with other districts that are currently going through tiered focused monitoring. So whatever follow-up based on those meetings would be the requirements for those NI districts. Is that right, Amy and Bonnie?
Yes, that's right. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you.
And if you're an NA district and you have not heard from us, then you're fine for this year. And we'll be ramping up after determinations next year.
Thank you. And then, so that's all that needs to be submitted. So I've had a couple people ask, is there anything else that needs to be submitted? We did tell NI districts that this was required. We're not asking you to submit anything. We can see what districts are here, so we're good. There's nothing more you have to do on that. Thank you very much for asking the question though. Erica, I'm going to go back. We had a question a little bit further back that I'm going to ask you. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of certificates of attainment on the graduation rate?
Sure, yeah. So students who earn a certificate of attainment are not considered graduates. So those students would not be counted as graduates when we do the graduation rate calculations.
Thank you, Erica. Holly and Brian, when we did the poll, I think it didn't display for the participants, so they weren't able to see the breakdown of percentages. Is it possible that we can send that information out? People are interested in what types of frameworks people are using. And I know we said planning for success was the one that most people picked, but if it's possible to send that out so people can have the information, several people
Absolutely.
might be interested in that. Thank you. And then Abby, I just have one more follow-up for you, if that's possible. Can you just talk a little bit about if a district is participating M-cubed this year, and I know that there's requirements as far as the amount of time that they need to be participating. And I think there's some confusion about determinations happening every year and the requirements for M-cubed. So can you talk about the requirements for participation in M-cubed as far as time and the difference between the annual determinations?
Sure. We're talking about the duration of the, it was decided some years ago in conversation with school districts about who were participating about what was most helpful. School districts presented to us a concern that if you want us to put in place a systemic change that's going to take several years to be fully implemented, to fund us for 1 year may not be helpful enough. And so it was decided that we would ask districts to participate or require districts when they were newly identified to participate for a minimum of 3 years. So they would have that 3-year period to do the strategic planning and make and put in place implementation of their systemic change. So for districts that have already participated for at least 3 years and are continuing to participate, that rule does not apply. But if you have participated in M-cubed as a district for less than 3 years and are still identified, then even if you are no longer in the needs intervention special education determination, but you have not completed 3 years of participation overall, then you would still be participating in the coming year. Does that answer, Jamie, what you're asking about?
It does. Thank you very much, Abby.
I think there are very few districts in that position at this point.
Yeah, I agree. But there was some questions, I think because there's so many different timelines that we have and requirements, it does get confusing, I think, at times for people. So thank you. There's a couple district related questions. I see one from Mashpee. I'm going to have Brian reach out to you because I think that's about significant disproportionality. So we'll reach out directly to you. And then I see one more question from James. We're going to also have somebody reach out directly to you because that's specific to your district as well. And Bonnie, I think we have answered everything in the Q&A.
I'm just double checking, Jamie, and I think we are all set. Yes.
Any of our panelists have anything else that they wanted to add or any follow-up or anything that you saw that you thought needed to be clarified? We thank you very much for spending time with us today. We hope this was helpful. We hope that you were able to take something or a few things, hopefully, that maybe you can implement in your district, some information maybe that's new or clarified. Feel free to reach out to us if there's anything else that you need from us, particularly those that are already working with either public school monitoring or SEP or other offices, Abby with M-cubed, Brian with significant disproportionality, and thank you to all the DESE offices that are here today. Have a great day, everybody.